Welcome. This is a lecture for week 9 of Game of Thrones. Well, we last met a few weeks ago when things were on the brighter side than they are now. And we just left with, our history ending with the Crusades and sort of a period of the Middle Ages. What we're going to see today, jumping ahead a few centuries, is how the contemporary Middle East has been shaped and designed not millennia ago, not centuries ago, but just 100 years ago by the British in cooperation with the French, but we're going to focus mostly on the British, which we're going to define as the Kingmakers. And essentially what we're going to see is how power has been shaped before the arrival of the British and changed after 1918 with the end of First World War and the establishment of British-French rule in the Middle East. This is a current map of the Middle East, and I just want to point out a few things. When you look at this map, and in particular you focus on the borders, I want you to remember that, and I'm going to highlight some of them, that most of these borders are sort of artificially, that have been artificially created at the end of the First World War and do not reflect division between people, ethnicity, religious groups, or historical borders that have been shaped through, history, through sort of treaties or understanding between the people. So when you look at borders like Iraq, these have been designed again after World War I. Iraq never existed before. Syria existed as a name and certainly as a region within the Ottoman Empire, but it was definitely a larger entity. And Lebanon too existed, but it was a smaller entity rather than the current state. Israel, Jordan didn't exist. Saudi Arabia is British invention of the late 1920s, and so forth. So we have to bear in mind all of this information because it helps us to understand how and how much the current Middle East is an artificial creation of the British and the French, who became real kingmakers, particularly the British, who created kingdoms in the region, but more importantly, they created the borders. And we are aware of the fact that these borders have created long-lasting conflict in the region. But let me start with a very brief overview of the Ottoman Empire. Last time we met, we talked about the Crusades, and now this area was affected by the Crusader activity with arrival through Europe, through France, Italy, and even Britain of Crusaders who established a kingdom in the region for about 100 years. Then the Middle East was once again retaken by Islamic forces, famously led by Salahuddin. In the centuries to come, we don't really have major changes. We just see different dynasties taking over. What is important for us is that at the beginning of the 14th century, we have the establishment of a new sort of dynasty, but very much started as a tribe, as a sort of a family tribe that expanded throughout modern-day Turkey and then Western Europe. When we talk about the Ottoman, and here you can see this in Turkish is called Vetura, or the symbol of the Ottoman Empire. The word Ottoman comes from the name Osman. Osman, the founder of the Ottoman Empire. Now, when it was obviously established as an entity, it was not yet an empire. It was just a small principality, like like a small state, city-state in this region of Turkey. They were based in a city called Bursa, and essentially they represented the interest of Muslim forces in this region. The Turks arrived from Central Asia, and they arrived together with the Mongol forces to fight the Mongols in the 13th century. Now, Turkish tribes established themselves around this area, which was the border between sort of Islam and Christianity, or the Byzantine Empire. Eventually, the House of Osman was able to conquer territories, in fact, to expand within what now we can call Eastern Europe, effectively encompassing all of this area, and up until 1453, they were able to take over Eastern Europe, but not to capture Constantinople. It's only in 1453 that the Ottomans, thanks to also the use of the first sort of weaponry relying on gunpowder. In fact, they relied on fairly large cannons, not very precise, not very effective, but certainly very scary. They were able to conquer Constantinople, that then was renamed Istanbul. Just a few decades later, eventually the Ottomans took over all of the other areas of the Middle East that were ruled by another dynasty called the Mamluks, originating from the Caucasus, but controlling the Middle East from Egypt, from Cairo. And eventually, by the 15th century, you can see that the Ottomans were controlling basically three major regions: North Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. By the 15th, 16th century, essentially the Ottomans were the superpower in Europe and in the Mediterranean region. Let me be very clear with this. France, Britain, so emerging kingdoms, they were all dealing with the Ottomans as in a position of inferiority. They were trying to establish connections with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were the superpower. So we have to think about, for a couple of centuries, the Ottomans were sort of the hegemonic power in the region, with a major influence in Europe and in European politics. The Ottomans twice sieged Vienna and failed to take it. The last time that happened was in 1683. Eventually, 1683 really marked the beginning of the Ottoman decline, where eventually the empire slowly shrunk. And we're going to see how that happened. The empire eventually collapsed in 1918 with the end of World War I, but the empire itself was dissolved in 1922. And as a piece of information, very anecdotal, the last heir to the throne died just a few years ago in New York, leaving no direct heir to the Ottoman throne. Not that anyone is going to claim that title, but yet, just to give you, also that small details. Let's explain a little bit the structure of power within the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is a painting with all of the sultans that succeeded each other from the very beginning. So with the figure of Osman. Well, didn't do a very good circle here, but let's try to be a little bit more precise. So this is Osman, who established the dynasty. Then, we have all of the following sultans. What is interesting is that in Ottoman historiography and history itself, the tree is a very important symbol because it really represents the Ottoman dynasty and the succession. Let me explain a couple of things. The Sultan, so the sort of emperor we would translate, these figures that took over the Ottoman Empire, succeeded each other in a different fashion than from European rulers. Effectively, within the house, upon the death of a previous sultan, there was a competition, which often ended with the killing of brothers. Brothers who were aware of the possibility of being challenged. Sometimes they would strike first. Sometimes the weaker brothers won the battles for whatever reasons. So we have plenty of stories about it. It sounds very different from what happened in Europe. But the reality is that in Europe too, there were internecine, so internal battles. Even though there was this principle of, the dynasties was continued by the firstborn, the first male born. But we also are aware of the fact that there were obviously games, plural, of thrones in order to conquer power. But certainly in the Ottoman Empire, this was much more open and it was not hidden. The Sultan was also the Caliph. The Caliph, meaning the successor of a prophet. This is a title that the Ottomans inherited upon the conquest of the rest of the Middle East, so in the 16th century, 1517, when they conquered all of the Middle East and North Africa. And eventually they came also to control Mecca and Medina, the holy cities of Islam. In general, Ottoman sultans were not relying too much on this title. Obviously, they were aware of the fact that they were not direct descendants of the Prophet. Nevertheless, occasionally they use the title in order to promote military campaigns or to promote their legitimacy upon conquering power, upon taking power, particularly after a battle between brothers in order to succeed the dying or already dead sultan. Now, sultans had obviously direct power over the people, but we also have a structure in place which reflects also what we see in Europe in a sense. We have a government which was led by a Grand Vizier, Prime Minister, and a series of viziers, ministers dedicated to the various businesses of the state. We have regional provincial governors appointed by Istanbul, ruling over the provinces of empire, responding directly to Istanbul. Governors were shady figures. Sometimes they were very effective, very efficient. Sometimes they were corrupted, easily corruptible, and certainly not necessarily efficient or effective in their job. Let me talk about two major structures of power within the Ottoman Empire. The harem. I'm sure probably you heard of the harem, which is being misrepresented for centuries. We tend to think about the harem as this secret place full of women where the sultan had access essentially to have sex. And has always been misinterpreted as this place with a lot of women, and men could go in and basically have physical pleasure. On one hand, that's partly true. The harem was the place where all of the women, the wives of the sultan and the concubines, would live, raise their children. And certainly the sultans had access, in order to have sex, whether for fun or to procreate, so to have children. But that was highly regulated, and it's much more complex than that. In fact, the harem was the real seat of power, particularly in terms of succession. This is where children were raised, given an education, and children could already spot the potential challenges for the future. Mothers were extremely important because mother would protect or support their own children or the children of other mothers, depending on the current, the situation that they lived in. Just to give you an example, a very important example. Mehmet II, who conquered Constantinople, was in fact the son of a Christian woman, not a biological son. He was essentially adopted by this Christian woman who happened to be the wife of a sultan. Obviously, she lived as a Christian, converted to Islam, but that was not the point. The point is that he was raised by one of the wives of a sultan and provided great education, skills that eventually led him to take power upon the death of his father. But more importantly, she educated him in the art of war and diplomacy, and he was able to conquer finally Constantinople, and then the rest of the Middle East a decade later. So again, the importance of the harem as a seat of power more than anything else. And then when we talk about the military, we have to split this institution in two. A regular army, which we don't really cover at the moment, but we're going to cover the Janissaries, or in Turkish, Yeniçeri, sort of the new corps, the new military corps. Who are the Janissaries? This is a very interesting case study. Janissaries, or the Janissary army, was composed of young men taken from Eastern Europe, essentially kidnapped from their families, given an education, trained as military, given power, and eventually they became the backbone of the entire Ottoman state, as they were moving, protecting the borders, quelling rebellions, and expanding the empire. But we have to remember, they were slaves, essentially, yet slaves who could reach the power. So we need to clarify that. There is a sense in the literature, every time we talk about the Janissaries, that they were slaves similarly to the slaves that we have and slavery that we have in the southern parts of the United States in the 19th century. That's not the case. Yes, these children were kidnapped, so taken against the will of their parents. I'm going to tell you in a second that there were plenty of exceptions. They were given an education, and essentially they became elites. The exception is that in times of crisis, plenty of families would rather give up to the Ottomans their children, to male children, to the Ottoman state, rather than seeing them die of starvation or of lack of food or internal issues. So again, nothing is black or white. There's always a blurred and a gray area in the middle. But yet the origin of the Janissaries is related to this idea of creating of a slave loyal to the Sultan army, composed of young men from specific ethnic groups, so they were all from the Balkans, converted to Islam, given an education, and eventually became elites. The Janissary army is the most crucial element in the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Now, within the regions of the Ottoman Empire, however, particularly after the conquest of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, we don't really have a large presence of Turkish officials. The Turks moved around, many went to live in Greece, so we obviously have an expansion of Turkish population around the region, but not necessarily they settled down everywhere in the empire. So the Ottomans relied on local notables, essentially figures, relevant individuals in their own local context. So local politics was dominated by these groups who acted as channel between the main power, the central power in Istanbul, and the population. Yeah, obviously we do have local governors, but they really channel that, sometimes dealing directly with the governor or superseding that channel and going directly to Istanbul. So the local notables are certainly a very important role in all of the Ottoman society. What is important to remember is that once the Ottoman Empire expanded, particularly in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East and later on, the empire was multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-religious. In fact, up until the late 19th century, despite the Ottoman Empire was Islamic, as the Sultan was obviously Muslim, the largest majority of the population was Christian, with large Jewish communities all around the empire, particularly Alexandria in Egypt and Salonika in Greece. So that tells us that also in terms of notables, we don't just have Muslim notables, but we also have Christians and Jewish notables with high degree of power in their own communities. Of course, to become or remain viable, notables had to use their power to show that they were heard in Istanbul, they were heard by local governors, and they were providing services to the local populations. So that they constantly had to prove their necessity. So this is a cartoon taken from a late 18th century French paper that basically shows an Ottoman ruler. Obviously, you can see the form of racism painting like sort of black, looking like a monkey in a sense, with all of these turkey, but also other birds, you know, going there and talking to the local governor, in this case, representing the different voices, and also the different animals came to represent also the different ethnic religious groups of the Ottoman Empire. But that gives you a sense of how complex was the structure of power in the Ottoman Empire. And how did these people become notable? Well, very much based on land, which they own, ability to collect taxes and then given to the Ottoman Empire. Some were traders, merchants, or they were religious figures, very important families who could claim direct linkage with Prophet Muhammad or important figures in Christianity or Judaism. Let me go back briefly to the Janissaries, because I mentioned a few details earlier, but I think this deserves a little bit of a better explanation. And here you can see a picture of the Janissaries in the late 19th century, early mid 19th century, right before it was disbanded. So this is approximately 1820s or so. As I mentioned earlier, this was formed in the 14th century. It was an elite army called Yeniçeri in Turkish, composed of Christian boys. What is important in our context is the concept of loyalty to the Sultan, and as already mentioned, of slavery. They were not slaves in the way we think, but they were loyal. So the slavery concept is related to loyalty, the fact they were loyal to the death to the Sultan. And also I have to explain that there was no resentment. They were highly educated. Many of them left chronicles, diaries, lots of documents available from the Janissaries. No one praised the system to basically kidnap children, but none of them later on sort of criticized the system. There was an understanding that this was the way to keep the empire together. Besides, they were given position in the elites. Now, one key point is that in general, Janissaries were not meant to marry, not to have children. They were meant to be loyal and only loyal to the Sultan, and to die in battle or as wise, meaning elderly, later on in life. But the system eventually was corrupted, and by the beginning of the 19th century, eventually Janissaries began to establish their own power base in various regions. They had families, they had children, they had requests. They wanted to keep their own power over the communities that they dominated. Eventually, in 1826, during a period of reforms in the Ottoman Empire, the Janissary Corps was disbanded, but at a very high price. This reminds me, and again, going back to the Crusaders lecture, to the Crusaders as fighters who were essentially killed and executed by the French army after the Crusader order was declared illegal by the Pope. What happened here is a similar trajectory. The Sultan declared the Janissary as illegal. They were gone. So either they were accepting the authority of a state, or they were going to suffer the consequences. Many died. Many accepted a new role in society, and they became part of the regions they lived. Nowadays, you can still travel around the Middle East, and sometimes you find people who define themselves as Circassians, which is a region of the Caucasus. That tells you that obviously those communities were composed of Janissaries and Circassians who decided to settle down after 1826 instead of fighting against the Ottoman decision to disband the Janissary Corps. Let's now move to the beginning of the 20th century, and this concept of enter the Kingmakers, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the arrival of new rulers who reshaped the modern Middle East, giving us what we know nowadays. Now, here is a map of World War I. With the two sort of blocks. In green, you have the Allied powers, so Britain, France, Italy, Russia, and then later on other countries. And then, of course, the central powers with Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria, and Ottoman Empire. I'm not going into the details of the war itself. What is important for us is that the Ottoman Empire, for a variety of reasons, joined the war in the first place, which was not a given. There was not real necessity for the Ottomans to join the war, but they did, again for a number of reasons. And eventually they joined the war effort alongside the Germans and the Austrians. This means that the British and the French, partly the Italians, began to plan the future of the Ottoman lands. Now, this is nothing new. The idea of carving out the Ottoman Empire had been in the making already for a century and a half. A number of Eastern European countries became independent thanks to the help of the British, the French, the Russians. Egypt was occupied by the British in 1882, Tunisia occupied by the French, so Algeria, Libya by the Italians in 1911. So we can see that the empire was shrinking in terms of territorial control. But what happened in World War I and after World War I is even more complex in a sense and more impactful on the livelihood and the situation, daily life of the people living in the region. Now, let me explain a few things. During World War I, we have a number of agreements that succeeded each other that were signed by different actors, each and one of them with different meaning, understanding, and force. The first one occurred in 1915. Here you have to picture. On the right side, you have McMahon, who was the governor of Egypt, obviously the British governor of Egypt. And on the left side, you have the Sharif of Mecca. Obviously, McMahon was appointed by the British. Just allow me a couple of things here. He was appointed by Lord Kitchener, who used to be the previous governor of Egypt, but then upon the beginning of World War I was called in London to serve as Minister of War. Eventually died at the very beginning of the war as his ship was sunk by the Germans in the Northern Sea. Point being, McMahon had very little knowledge of the Middle East, but he was directed to sort of communicate either with the Ottomans or the Arabs across the border. Sharif of Mecca, and you can pick up the word Sharif, an Arabic word that we borrowed, think about the word Sharif, which literally means the protector of the holy places. He could claim direct descendancy from the Prophet. He was appointed by the Ottomans, paid by the Ottomans, therefore an Ottoman subject and hence an enemy of the British. Yet, for whatever reason, he engaged in exchange of letters with McMahon, and by 1915, when the British were actually failing and they'd been defeated in Gallipoli and Kut El Amara, modern-day Iraq, British and Sharif Hussein began to engage in talks for a possible Arab help defeating the Ottomans in exchange for an Arab kingdom. Now, what we know is that first of all, there were not really Arab forces. There were certainly tribes supporting Sharif Hussein of Mecca, but not all of the Arabs supported this idea. Besides, it was still a secret. The big surprise was that the British actually accepted that and made promises. Normally the British would make very vague promises like, yeah, you can get some land or we can talk about this later. The British made promises on a map. As you can see here, they draw a line. They said, look, the lands and territories close to the sea, they have to be decided later, but then whatever is on the right side of that line, then can be your caliphate, can be your kingdom. What is interesting is that the British at the same time, they were engaging with the French. And while it looks like a contradiction, certainly was not for the British. They were inconsistent indeed, but this is the way imperial thinking works. You create multiple scenarios. So early in 1916, the British engaged in official talks with the French. Two officials were appointed, Mark Sykes on the left screen, a young British officer of Catholic origin, so-called expert because he traveled around the Middle East. Not that he spoke any language, but he traveled. On the other hand, the French appointed Georges Picot. He was certainly more expert. He served as a French consul in several areas of the Middle East, and last before leaving at the beginning of World War I, he was the French consul in Beirut in modern-day Lebanon. So he certainly had a better knowledge of the Middle East. The two engaged in a number of talks supported by British officials and came up with a plan. A plan which obviously was meant on the idea that the French and the British would defeat the Ottomans. They would carve out the Middle East for themselves. They created an international zone for what is nowadays Israel, Palestine, for the reason that they acknowledge the presence of holy places, mostly Christian holy places, nothing to do with the Jews or the Muslim, but this was about Christianity. And then created two spheres of influence, A zone and B zone, and then one blue zone and one red zone under direct either British one and French, the other one, control. Now, if you look at this map, you can realize that there are similarities to the modern Middle East. Now, obviously, this eventually became Iraq, this became Jordan, this became Syria and Lebanon, this was given back to Turkey, and of course this one became Palestine, then to become Israel and the occupied territories of nowadays. There's obviously differences here. I mean, this was just a map that was designed. The Sykes-Picot Agreement eventually was denounced at the end of World War I as a result of the intervention of the Americans, of President Wilson at the end of the war. But yet the British somehow used this map as a blueprint for the redefinition of the Middle East together with the French after the war. Last but not least, just to add another inconsistency in all of this planning, it's the famous or infamous, better say, Balfour Declaration. November 2nd, 1917. While this document had been in the making for at least a number of months, this letter was published on every newspaper saying that the British, in this case Lord Balfour, obviously signing the letter, were promising the Jews the establishment of a national home in Palestine. Now, this was a revolution in a sense. The Jews never really played a major role in British policy making up to this point, but yet the British, for different reasons, mainly for propaganda reasons, decided to engage with the Zionists. Zionists were supporters of a sort of revival of a Jewish nation, possibly in Palestine, engaging with them, and particularly engaging with an individual, Chaim Weizmann, who happened to be a professor of chemistry at the University of Manchester and the leader of the Zionist movement in Britain, and eventually they come up with this promise. Now, bear in mind, let's go back for a few seconds here. The British in 1915 engaged with the Arabs. Governor of Egypt representing the British, the Arabs represented by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, an Ottoman subject. Secret correspondence. At the same time, they officially engaging with the French at a governmental level. Secret treaty. November 1917. This is a public letter published in every single newspaper in Britain, France, Italy, America, and then reported also by the enemy newspapers, with the Lord Balfour, Secretary of State, Minister for Foreign Affairs, promised the Jews a land in Palestine. So you can see the different nature of documents. What is interesting is that they all had repercussions. Arabs have always been bitter with the British ever since. The French and the British agreement brought to the creation of a modern Middle East. The Balfour Declaration, in the long term, led to the creation of a state of Israel and all of the problems that we have in the region up to now. This is a map of the modern Middle East created in 1920 as a result of the establishment of the mandates. The mandates were a new invention out of the League of Nations, essentially to please President Wilson, who sent American troops, and we understand how these were vital in defeating the Germans. So what we have a creation of new nation states, new borders, new identities, new capital cities, new bureaucracies, new structures, and obviously a different future for the people living in the region. They were part of an empire, they were part of a one entity with all the differences and problems. Now they're all part of different states. Let me give you a silly example. Think about it. Maybe you are a Christian family living in Beirut, but you have relatives living in Ramallah, which is a Palestinian city here. During the Ottoman times, you would travel to Ramallah, like we do nowadays, from point A to point B without any borders. But now, with the establishment of these states, all of a sudden you have a border here. Custom, duties, passports, difficulties to cross the borders. And after 1948, the border has been shut. So you can see all of the problems that were created as a result of this new structure, of these new borders created by the British and the French after World War I. Now, the French and the British exported their own ways of ruling the Middle East. The French created republics. So in Syria and Lebanon, they created two republics, mirroring what was the French Republic. Independence was granted only in 1946, and it was not an easy one, meaning that Charles de Gaulle, after World War II, was quite eager to keep those lands as part of France or colonial territories. What I mentioned earlier, what is important to remember, is that while the names Lebanon and Syria existed, those borders were created artificially. And think about what happened in Lebanon in the 1970s. A long-lasting civil war, nearly 20 years. Very much the results, the long-term results of the creation of those borders. Lebanon was ruled by Christians that at the beginning of the 1920s were a majority. But eventually, that majority shifted in favor of Muslims. Simply, they had more children. And that brought to a destabilization of the country. Syria, the largest majority of people whom are Sunni Muslims, was ruled and is still ruled by an Alawi family. So a minority of, it's a minority within Islam. Alawis were put in power by the French, and they remained in power up to nowadays, with different forms and shapes. The British, on the other hand, reflecting their own structure, they created kingdoms. Besides, they were kingmakers. They needed to pay back some of the promises made to the Arabs. So when Iraq was created out of 3 Ottoman provinces, eventually the son of Sharik of Mecca was crowned king of Iraq. Actually, he had been very much appreciated by Iraqis. They were aware that he was not Iraq himself, but he was a man of his words. He was clever. He understood his position as somehow, a foreigner, while speaking Arabic, but still a foreigner coming into a new country. So he quickly adapted to this. Unfortunately, his successors were not as great as he proved to be. Eventually, the kingdom collapsed, and through a number of coups, became a republic later on. On the other hand, the monarch in Jordan still exist. Transjordan was created in order to give the Arabs a territory. So when the British first created Palestine, they envisioned Palestine in all of this territory. But in 1922, eventually was decided to split it in two and create the Kingdom of Transjordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. Abdullah, eventually to become Abdullah I, again the other son of Sharif of Mecca, was crowned and the monarchy is still in place. By then, Transjordan was essentially inhabited by tribes with no major economic resources. It's only after 1948 that actually have major changes, when, as a result of a Palestinian diaspora, thousands of refugees from Palestine moved into Jordan and they helped the development of the country. Let me give you an anecdote about Transjordan. When you look at the map, you perhaps wonder about this. Why creating this sort of a bizarre shape for Transjordan? Well, the story goes that Winston Churchill, who had a major role in creating the map of the modern Middle East, was drinking a cup of tea and he struck a line and created that, and he said that's fine. The reality was to create a buffer area between French-ruled Syria and Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, that gives you the sense of a poor attention. The fact that Churchill talked about this episode tells you that they were not concerned about what people wanted or thought about these new borders. They were just acting out of their own interest. Now we reach a conclusion, and I want to end with a quote from Winston Churchill. Now, first of all, focus on the picture. You probably recognize Winston Churchill. Then you might be aware of this gentleman here, Lawrence of Arabia. Don't really have the time to go into it, but he's a very important figure in World War I in the Middle East, a very interesting character who supported the Arabs and felt betrayed after Winston Churchill said that. The Middle East is one of the hardest hearted areas in the world. It has always been fought over, and peace has only reigned when a major power has established firm influence and it's shown that it would maintain its will. At present, our friendship is not valued and our enmity is not feared. Now, Winston Churchill didn't really like the Middle East, and remember, during World War I, Winston Churchill, as a result of leading the British in the major failure of Gallipoli, disappeared from government, but in the 1920s regained a position of power, and as a minister for colonies, he had a major role in redesigning the Middle East and keeping the Arabs out of decision making, something that upset T. Lawrence. Now, here we can see some of the issues. The Middle East has always been fought over. Really? What about Europe? What about all of the literally thousands of major of small wars fought in Europe up until the end of World War II? But from a European perspective, it's always easier to look at somebody else's territory and land and regions than ourselves. And to say that peace has only reigned when a major power has established firm influence, isn't that the same in Europe? And is it really true for the Middle East? Yes, certainly we have empires that succeeded each other, but it doesn't mean there was always been conflict in the Middle East. Conflict, in fact, is very much the result, particularly contemporary conflict, of the British, the French, the Kingmakers. They created the context into which people had to live, deal with new identities, new structure of powers, and eventually some of those collapsed. Some of those came to clash with each other, creating a condition of constant warfare, at least in some parts of the Middle East. But it doesn't mean that Middle Eastern people are in for constant war. It's given the context and the difficulties to reconcile what the British and the French brought in the British and the French in the first place destroyed the previous order, brought into a new order, imposed it top down without sort of explaining it, pretending that people would simply fit in. And when conflict arose as a result of that, they despised the people, saying, well, it's your fault because you don't value our friendship. Look what we gave you. George Bush, 2003, we're going to export democracy. Right? And then criticizing the Iraqis do not value democracy. No, the Iraqis do value democracy, but perhaps as a path towards achieving that particular goal, not as imposed top-down. So here's the end of our lecture for today, where we really briefly looked at how the British in particular, but also the French, came to be the kingmakers of the Middle East, not just in terms of power structures, but also of geography, creating the modern Middle East. I'll be very happy to take all of your questions and issues related to this topic, or if you want more sources related to it, I'll be very happy to give a list, which hopefully you can find online, given the time and the inability, obviously, to access the library. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the week and the weekend.